Our goal in these sessions is to highlight the incredible work that's happening with our practitioners, to really focus on the equity, diversity, and inclusion work, right? And so we have been inviting folks to contribute to our community agreements. So if you would please take a look, we all have been trained and we've all learned how to be in community. But this is our first, for many of us, experience of coming together to do community in this space. And so how do we get really clear and transparent about the way that we're going to engage? So if you would just take a look at those agreements. It's an editable document. So if you want to add more ideas, maybe think about, is there one or two of these agreements that you want to focus on today? So I'll give you a minute just to look them over. So I'll invite us back together. Hopefully there are a few statements in here that are really resonating with you, that you're going to be practicing today as we work to create our community for some really great learning. So today we are really fortunate to have Richard and Nika, who are going to lead us through some amazing work. So I'm gonna hand things over to both of you.
Welcome everybody. If you're just joining us, we're just getting started, and we just, Lauren just gave an overview of these Equity in Action Praxis sessions that we do on Tuesdays, and shared our community agreements that we've developed over time. So welcome if it's the first time coming to this space. So I'm Nika Hogan. I'm from Pasadena City College and 3CSN, and my colleague Richard Abdelkarim, who's also from Pasadena City College and a mathematics professor, was kind enough to join us today. And we're going to do just a little bit of framing, and then we're going to interview Richard and just sort of get some conversation going about, how do we support students in STEM? How do we support more equitable participation and outcomes, and really help our students who come with big ambitions to college to stick with the program of study that their heart had settled on, and when we know that this is really hard to pull off. So I'll just do a little bit of framing. So this is the big question, and it's been really well established over decades of research that we lose women of color, we lose people of color, we lose women in the STEM fields. We have people enter college with stated aspirations and goals, and they leave us or change majors at really staggering rates. And so how do we empower students to persist in STEM fields? That is the question that many of us have been wrestling with for a really long time. And Richard and I have worked on several grant projects together that are focused on just that. And that's part of what we're going to share today, as well as a new opportunity that's a grant-funded professional learning opportunity. So these are kinds of the things that we're struggling with. So how do we support learning, like deep learning, learning that transfers? How do we do that in this online emergency space that we've been in for more than a year? And how do we do it all the time? We know that active learning works. We have plentiful research about that. We also have research that shows us that students actually learn more through active learning, but will report that they've learned less. So there's a lot of barriers to it. It doesn't feel as comfortable. It doesn't feel natural. So how do we enact truly equitable practices? How do we get people talking, making sense of things, really participating, and doing so in an equitable way, so that when you look in the room and see who's talking, who's answering, or who's writing, who's participating, who's contributing, how do we make sure that that everybody has the chance to do that, rather than just the people who already feel comfortable? And what are the things that we can control? Because a lot of times people feel a lot of constraints, whether it be from their course outline of record, outcomes and objectives. They feel that there's content that needs to be covered, and maybe their colleagues are mean to them when they try things. There's a lot of things, but what can we control within this landscape? So we do know, we know for sure, and we can be really confident from 2000, when the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine published their groundbreaking collection, How People Learn, all the neuroscience, all of the brain research about how learning actually works. We can kind of boil it down to three things. People have got to have their prior knowledge engaged. People have got to organize and understand knowledge in the concept of a bigger conceptual frame. So it can't just be procedure, procedure, procedure. It can't just be facts and facts. It has to be connected, and it has to be within a larger framework. And we know that learners have to take a metacognitive approach to their own learning. So why is it so hard to pull off? If we know what we need to do, and we're plenty motivated to do it, why is this so hard to pull off? And this is where I'm going to start to interview my colleague, Richard. And I'll just start. Thank you again, Richard, for being here to talk about this and give us some insights and some thoughts. And I just also want to let everybody know that after we have this conversation, you're going to have an opportunity to talk in small breakouts, and then we'll come back together and share some common thoughts. And also we'll share with you this learning community opportunity that we have. But so Richard, just start by telling us a bit about yourself. Like, what's your background? How have you been working on equity in math? Just the basics.
Hi, everyone. I'm Richard Abdel Karim. As Nika said, Pasadena City College. I teach math, and I started back in 2011, and I kind of like dove in right away into various curriculum redesign projects. And we had like various opportunities for professional development, both on my campus and through reading apprenticeship, to have more equitable teaching practices, to bring more people in, to make people feel welcome. And when you're in STEM, there's this culture of it's cold, it's neutral, and that's just the way it is. And I've been realizing over the years that it's not neutral, and it does exclude people by the very nature of a lot of the traditional things that we perpetuate, because we have a tendency to teach the way we were taught, and it's very difficult to move against that, even with the information that doing things that way is exclusionary to certain groups of people. So that was not the basics. Sorry, Nika.
No, that's good.
I've worked on several grant projects, both, as Nika said, with Nika and also on my campus. So before AB 705 happened, there was a basic skills and student outcomes transformation grant. And I, with another colleague at my college, we worked with that grant, and various, as I said, various curriculum redesign projects, including designing the support courses to help implement AB 705. And then as far as classroom practice, doing just developing my own practice through reading apprenticeship and seeing how the reading apprenticeship framework applies in a math context, and just trying to continually adapt it, because I began my professional development in reading apprenticeship in a more cross-disciplinary environment, but I saw a lot of value and a lot of potential for innovation that could bring more students and more types of students in. And Nika, well, this might come up in a later question, but Nika said a lot of the things already that I will echo, but it's okay to hear those things twice because they're important. So I'll just leave it at that for now.
So do you feel like between the two of us, we've already identified some of the most challenging aspects of trying to run active and equitable learning environments in math or STEM?
Yeah, so the two things you mentioned, Nika, that I will echo because I experienced them is the two challenges are student buy-in and faculty buy-in.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, on the administrative side at my campus, it happens to be very hospitable to innovation and change. I know that's not the same at other campuses, so that could be a challenge for some of you as you do this work, or if you've already been engaging in this work. But student buy-in, I definitely have had some difficult experiences as I developed my own practice in doing things in a different way, in an innovative way. There's this combination of high support and high challenge, and it's something I continue to aspire to, but especially early on in my practice was something that was kind of difficult to navigate. But I think what I find helpful is having a community of others that are pursuing this type of work to affirm what I'm doing and to exchange ideas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So when, your students might be withering, you get discouraged, but if you've got colleagues, they're kind of can help encourage you and also hold you accountable to your own goals and aspirations for what you're trying to do. Yeah,
Exactly.
that's been my experience as well. So you've mentioned reading apprenticeship. So what does that look like? Like, what is that? What does that look like in a math context? Because it sounds like it would be unrelated.
Yes, thank you. So Reading Apprenticeship is a framework that is focused on the fact that as experts in our discipline, we're not just experts in the content of our discipline, we're also experts in reading texts of our discipline. And one of the ways to help students become more self-sufficient learners is to guide them, to apprentice them into becoming better readers within our discipline. So in math, there's very specific strategies that you use to read math texts that are different from what an English instructor would want students to do with, say, a novel or a poem or an essay. And even those three have different strategies within each other. So within each discipline, there are these reading moves, and it's not just about reading, it's also about sharing your thought process and, as the expert, and giving opportunities for the students to share their thought process as novices in your discipline, and having those thought processes talk to each other. We refer to that as the metacognitive conversation, where people's thought processes are talking to each other.
Okay, so can you give an example of, like, what do your students do sometimes that would be metacognitive conversation? Like, what does that look like?
So one very tried and true example is think aloud. So I'll give a pretty simple example and it doesn't just work with word problems. I know you might think reading, math, the only thing I can think of is word problems. We can start there and talk about that. But you can apply this with like a graph or a table of numbers or a diagram that's supposed to represent some concept. But like just taking word problems as an example, having a really tough word problem and just kind of like zipping through it, students are not going to get much out of it. If you make them do what we call a think aloud, where they actually take turns reading the problem and saying what they're thinking as they're reading, regardless of whether it's right or wrong, and there isn't any right or wrong, it's just whatever thoughts come to mind, they are so actively engaged in trying to understand the problem that they are able then to unlock the meaning of the problem and what they're supposed to do much more smoothly. And you might think, oh, I have so much to cover in STEM, how do I take time to do that? But I assure you the time pays for itself.
Because they're actually, like, it might take longer to read the problem, but it's actually with comprehension, or
Right.
Sense is being made. Yeah, that makes sense. It's funny because you're talking about the students thinking aloud, and when I think about a math classroom, I always see the instructor at the board solving the problem and talking out loud, talking through it. Right. So I feel like in a typical math or STEM classroom, it's really normal. It's a really normal practice to think aloud, but usually it's the instructor that shares their thinking, but not the students sharing their thinking. So why, is it important that the students get to also think aloud and share their thinking? For you as an instructor, why is that important?
Yeah, one thing I was going to say earlier, and thank you for bringing it up, is the reason it's helpful to know what students are thinking is that it helps guide my instruction. Like, because I really only want to focus on what the students need. And the only way I can find out what students need is if I give them an opportunity to think about stuff and share their thought processes with each other. And then, to some extent with the larger group and me. And by doing that, it gives me a lot of cues as to where to go next. What should I focus more on? Is this something that I need to spend more time on? Is this something that I can just move on from? And when you do that enough, you kind of get a rhythm, and any worries you have about, oh, I'm not going to cover everything that I'm supposed to cover, those kind of melt away because you're prioritizing things in the moment and you're practicing prioritizing. So because every group of students is different, like I said, we classically think of STEM as cold and neutral, but we all know from teaching any subject that every group of students brings a different dynamic. And to respect that dynamic and make the most of that dynamic, it's important to give students that opportunity to share their thought processes. And, it also speaks to the social and personal aspects of being in a classroom, which we tend to neglect in STEM.
Mm-hmm. And this feels connected to me to culturally responsive or culturally sustaining practices. I know you have a ton of expertise because you're always learning and growing in this field of equitable instruction. What kind of connections do you see? How is equity supported through this metacognitive conversation you're describing?
I think that by giving students an opportunity to express their thoughts, their voices are heard in the classroom. And, by doing routines like this, you can get around this dynamic that tends to happen in a lot of classrooms, regardless of subject, which is like, maybe you're an engaging lecturer and maybe you're really good at sharing your thought process about what you're talking about as the instructor. And maybe people are listening and paying attention, but they're not getting as much out of it as you would like, which is evidenced by how they perform on assessments. And what I kind of like went on a little tangent just now, but to answer your question, I'm thinking about those 5 or 6 students that you ask a question to the class, and it's always those same 5 or 6 students, or maybe even like 1 or 2 students. So you don't know anything about what anyone else. Oh, my internet is unstable. Can you still see me and hear me? Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
So in order to get the voices of those other people and to kind of check in with them, you can't, ask each person in a whole group setting one by one. You need to give opportunities for them to talk to each other. And what that does is creates more equitable airtime for people to talk and air out their thoughts. And it's much less threatening as a student, especially if you're not super confident in the subject or in the topic being discussed. It's more threatening to talk in the whole group. So giving opportunities to talk in a smaller group to a student rather than to an instructor who's viewed as the expert is, it helps the student, develop more confidence in the subject and feel like their voice has a place in the classroom.
Thank you. It also, as you were talking, I just had this memory of being in high school and in calculus or whatever, and sitting in class and the instructor explaining and going over everything and being perfectly fine, following along, no problem, and then go directly home, sit down at my kitchen table, open up that book to start the homework, and just hitting a wall, So I just feel like maybe it sounds like getting your hands dirty a little bit in class might ease that transition from being, in guided by the teacher versus sitting by yourself at that kitchen table. Of course, everything is different now because of online. Speaking of that, I have one more question for you before we move along, and that is sort of random, but what is your favorite pandemic hack? So having to do everything remote all of a sudden, is there anything you came up with to try to create this sort of active and equitable environment that that you really like, actually? You might even keep it.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what keeping it would look like, but in terms of doing stuff online, because I have synchronous class meetings, and I'm sure a lot of us can relate to, okay, I'm the only person that you see. I'm possibly the only person you hear. Everyone else is the black tile with the name written on it, and they're on mute. Once in a while, maybe one or two people will say something out loud, but you'll never see their faces. So just to not feel as an instructor like I'm, speaking into a void, so to speak. I picked up a tip from another instructor that's in the professional learning community that I'm helping to facilitate this year, which is, I think he calls it 3, 2, 1, go, where you ask a question, you tell people to type it in the chat, but you tell them not to press enter yet. And then you give them like a couple minutes, and then you tell them, okay, everybody press enter. And then you see all these answers appear in chat. And it's just so affirming, like, oh, they're there and they're paying attention. And I'm getting to see a lot of different people's ways of answering a question and the different ways they're saying it. Because what I did early pandemic was I would ask a question and I'd tell them to put it in the chat, and like 2 or 3 people put something, and then no one else is going to say anything because there's already answers there, right? So why would I put another answer in there if there's already an answer there? So making everybody do it at the same time, I get to see the different ways people think of. I don't know how that would adapt to going back in person, but that has been my favorite, just to check that they're still there and that they're engaged and that they're thinking, and to remind me that there are people behind this screen.
If back in a classroom, if we had those little mini whiteboards, they could, do their own, like themselves or in a small group, and then they could hold it up,
Yeah.
And so, because I like that idea of, it must normalize that sometimes you're wrong. And that's okay, because that's math. You're going to go back and figure out, oh, what did I miss? Oh, missed a step, or I missed or whatever, or yeah.
I did have a weird idea though. I thought it might be interesting to be in a classroom in person and still have a Zoom meeting and still do that chat thing where I'm really only paying attention to the chat when it's appropriate in the classroom setting. So maybe people are on their phones on Zoom or something in the classroom, and I'm like, okay, everybody answer this question, but don't press enter yet. And then they do, and then we can look at them together. I mean, that was a thought I had. It might be kind of crazy to try that, but I was thinking it might be interesting.
Or like in the chat, some people are saying poll everywhere.
Poll everywhere, yeah. I feel like there's more preparation required for that. Which works and is a good idea, but for me, like, I tend to do a lot of questions kind of on the fly.
Yeah.
So I think both work depending on like how much preparation you need to put into it.
All right. Thank you so much, Richard. So what I'm going to do now, before people go into groups, I'm just going to describe the learning community opportunity that we have briefly, so that you kind of have a full picture of what you might want to learn about here. If everything that Richard is talking about feels like your cup of tea and like these are your people, you might be interested in this, or you might have colleagues who are interested in it. And then you're going to have a chance to talk in small groups about, what resonates here, what ideas does it spark for you, and things like that. So this is the learning community. It's called Apprenticing Students into STEM Thinking. And it is a 3CSN and the CSU Office of the Chancellor Institute for Teaching and Learning. We went in together for this grant. And I put the description in the chat for you as well. And so Richard's been talking a lot about using reading apprenticeship as a helpful frame for doing the things he wants to do in terms of active and equitable learning environments. And so I just wanted to point out that in addition to what we know about what learners need, about almost 20 years after the original How People Learn, the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine published How People Learn 2, which has a lot more information about culture and about equitable practices. And they make a big deal in that book and really call out that we had this point about discourse, the languages that we use in communities. And so that could be different social communities that we have outside school, but it's very much applies to our academic disciplines. They all have their own specialized language. And students come in and they kind of get confronted by this jargon, and they feel so shut down. And it really exacerbates a lot of the discouragement that students are already navigating a lot of times in the college context. So we really feel like when we address that discourse issue in the way that Richard was talking about, like letting people make sense of things together in community in a really kind of low stakes way, actively sharing their thinking, mistakes are encouraged because that's part of learning. That really helps a lot. And so this is the framework that he was referring to and that he and I both think is really useful. We use a lot of different frames, lots of work about equitable and culturally relevant instruction, lots of frames about how learning works. But this one kind of tends to capture almost everything in that idea of metacognitive conversation. So paying attention to the people and the great strengths that they're bringing, building on those strengths, building a strong social dimension so that people can take risks together and learn together. Doing the cognitive like sit-ups and push-ups, like, yeah, problem solving is hard, get used to it. That's the name of the game, and building knowledge. So again, like, we're really into building knowledge that connects to where students are coming from rather than enforcing this sense of alienation, because they know a lot already. Okay. So basically, we focus on literacy, but in this very like academic discourse, STEM literacy, we focus on literacy to focus on equity. So we feel like when we do that, when we think closely about what are the texts that we're using, is it a problem, is it a graph, is it a paragraph, is it a word problem? When we pay attention to that and we're very selective about that, and we elevate some of those things to be like, let's pay attention to this and spend time on this in class and have everybody talk about this, then we are decoding the discipline. We're demystifying this foreign area. And we're creating a sense that people can belong here and they can succeed here. So when we use this framework, we're just helping it keep us grounded in what is the brain-based research about how learning works? What do we know about equitable and culturally relevant practices? And then in this particular learning community, we're also focused on sharing, because it's a lot of effort to design teaching in this way. And people are always like, did anybody do this already on this topic? STEM disciplines have a high degree of agreement about what the content is. And so we're kind of trying to jump in. If we're talking about text and what do you do with text and how do you get the students talking about text? Well, they should be OER texts anyway, so we're, once we do that, so our learning community is sharing the planning work that they've done in a repository. So these are the details of the learning community. They are outlined on your sheet, and we will talk more about it when you come back if you would like. But what I would like to do now is invite you to go into small rooms. We always, in our Praxis sessions, we always give people a chance to talk in small groups, making connections, what's synergistic with your practice, who do you think might benefit from this, what questions or concerns do you have about what you're hearing, and then we'll come back together and we'll both be able to answer questions for you and also just hear where did your discussions go.